because the world is made for you, you don't ever have to think about changing things to make yourself fit into the world.
Not even aware of the problem, right? But if you're a French player or who like is going to be using a ZERTY as a keyboard, right? Like you're going to be used to the idea that if you go boot up a game, there's a really good chance that
that nobody has thought about you.
Butterscotch.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 462 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast of Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam and I'm the miscellaneous programmer.
I'm Sam and I'm the artiste.
And this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today's April 6th, 22x4. Before we get started, we have a warning. There's going to be profanity in this show. And we'd also like to thank our recurring supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net. Thank you so much for your monthly donations to help keep the podcast going. Now, this is actually our second attempt at recording this episode because we started recording it yesterday at the normal time. And about 15 minutes in, while Sam was mid-sentence, he got earthquaked.
Yeah.
What the fuck?
That really weird earthquake that hit like the New York City and Jersey area.
New Jersey,
shook all the way up to Connecticut. House started wobbling. And I was like, I'm gonna go, and so I went. And then it's one of those things where I got tornadoes in the back pocket, thunderstorms.
That's no problem.
Thing. I got a lot of context, for understanding those. I've actually not been in an earthquake before, so I was like, "Is everything okay? Can I hang out my house still afterwards? What happens?"
Yeah. So Sam was both emotionally and physically rattled, and so we just decided, you know what? Let's just give it a day. And we'll wait a day. Now I saw a hilarious thing because Sam basically was like, all right, hold on, I got to check stuff out. So he leaves. So Adam and I are just kind of chilling and we're like, what the fuck? So we're Googling, trying to figure out what's going on with this earthquake. And I saw this tweet because that's it's still the case that you can get like some real time stuff on Twitter, right? But you can't read much because if you try to click into it and look at more or look at replies, you got to pay Elon Musk or some shit to do that. So all I could see was a couple of initial tweets, but I saw one where somebody's like, oh my God, my feed's blowing up. There's people in Brooklyn, Queens, Connecticut, New Jersey. The whole East Coast is getting wrecked by this earthquake. I was like, that's like a 10-mile. Yeah. What? You just named a couple places right next to the earthquake, but I just got the whole East Coast is these
the New York
4
City
towns.
Central mindset. Yeah.
Yeah. So, so that happened. Everything's fine.
Yep.
Nobody's injured. House didn't split in two.
It
but also
was
Sam
just
moved his
weird,
Yeah, and you moved your podcast recording area to an upper floor, right?
I did.
So you probably got a little extra jingle.
I got some extra wibbly wobblies up here, and I was like, I don't feel like I should be up on the third floor during this situation.
So the only earthquake I've experienced was when I was going to USC for my my orientation, before classes started and stuff.
And that's
so I was
the
there
University of Southern California.
Yeah. So I was there with I think I was there with our mom, and I was taking some kind of a test or something to kind of do some placements into courses or something like that. So I was in a bottom floor, in a basement in a computer lab doing some shit. And afterwards I came out and everybody was talking about this crazy earthquake that happened. And I was like, what? So somehow either I just didn't notice because I was too in the zone, or
because your leg vibrates when you're focused on stuff and slightly.
Yeah. Oh,
you're just a mobile earthquake.
Yeah, I bet your leg was going so fast that that thing didn't even register.
You know how noise canceling headphones work, where they create a counter vibration that deletes. I probably just canceled the earthquake locally, in my sphere. So super easy though. Super easy to do.
Yeah, just shake your leg.
Common
I'm gonna do
mistake.
it next time. I'll just start shaking my leg.
Get that shaky leg. Just counteract.
Yep.
So anyways, so we're back on track. We got some stuff to talk about. Namely, the opening cutscene of Crashlands 2 has been released to YouTube. So so let's talk about this cutscene. So first of all, I want to say we didn't launch it to fanfare. We just put it up, and we didn't reach out to a bunch of media outlets and stuff. It's just kind of let's get this out there. So there's a few reasons why, but I do want to say that it's been super cool seeing all the comments on this thing because everybody's talking about nostalgia, which is fucking weird because we're not that old, right? We're like, I'm what am I? 37. How old am I?
You're almost 37.
Yeah.
I'm 36. Yeah, almost 37. And you know, I was, I guess, 28 or something when we launched Crashlands, and seeing people commenting on this opening cutscene for Crashlands 2, talking about all the nostalgia that this is bringing back from their childhood, right? Of like they were like 8 or 9 years old and they played Crashlands, and then now they're, you know, late high schoolers, or they're like ready to go to college, or they're in college or whatever. And this is like the music that we open with in Crashlands 2, the Crashlands 2 opening cutscene is the music from the Polari like villages in Act 3 of the first game. So if you're hearing the music and you recognize it, that means like you played through the whole game of Crashlands. And so it's like people are getting this nostalgia hit, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think I think it's because like nostalgia is not really about being old, right? So much as it is about
fond, distant memory.
Yeah. So it's like,
yeah.
I remember this with the, I think it was like Diablo 2 to Diablo 3 or something like that. You know, there was, what was it, 8 years? It was like 8 or 9, or maybe 11 years, something like that, between the two.
It was like 2000, I want to say 2001 was Diablo 2, something like that. It was
around
and
that,
then,
9 even. Something,
it was something around that. Yeah.
Or maybe 2000, yeah. And then Diablo 3 was like 2012 or something.
Yeah, so
big gap.
It is a big gap, but it's also one of those things where it's like the nostalgia, I think, comes from having essentially like, you know, having had some things happen to you between, you know, that thing and that memory in the past and then where you are now. Not so much like a ton of time passing per se, but like particular kinds of time. And I think the fact that Crashlands is played by people, you know, essentially by like a lot of people in that kind of 8 to like 16 range or so, you're hitting people right at a moment where the next couple of years, right, the next 4 to 8 years are tremendous.
It's a lot.
Change. Yeah, tremendous change. And so it's just kind of, it is fun. It's weird, and we did kind of craft it with that in mind, you know, because it is a sequel. We're trying to make sure that it had enough little deep cuts in it for people who are fans of the original. But yeah, it is very wholesome. I think reading through those comments, it doesn't happen much.
Yeah, but also and it was cool, yeah, because the comments were just universally people just being so hyped, just so psyched about this. And it's pretty rare to see just universal positive comments on a YouTube video. But also we kind of, as we were kind of thinking of what this cutscene was going to be and kind of how we wanted to bring people back into Crashlands 2, nostalgia was actually kind of like a central theme that we wanted to hit, because essentially like so in the cutscene, it is about sort of Flux, finishing up what she was doing on Wonope and then kind of venturing off to a new phase of her life, but then always kind of looking back and like wanting to go back and reconnect with her friends there and like just, you know, go back to a simpler time, you know?
Yeah.
And so that's
simpler
kind
time helping to save the world.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I mean, but you know, in a weird way, it kind of makes me think of like back like when we were making our first games, right? Where the problems we were solving were just as hard as the problems we're solving now. And we actually had some other even bigger problems at the time, right? But we didn't know much about how complicated things were. And we just had like one big thing to do, right? And like we kind of had this all consuming goal, right? Like in the case of getting Crashlands out, you know, Sam was going through some real shit at that time, and we all just had like just one thing, like we got to get this game done. And in a weird way, sometimes like those are the really like those are hard times of your life, but also they're simple.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
Yeah,
it's very focused.
It's just you're not mixing in a lot of what I would just consider nonsense, right? You're not spending a lot of energy on things that don't matter in a really tangible way, right?
Yeah, all these micro stressors. They just kind of.
Well, I think it's that they're all there, but you're still dealing with them. It's just that
You just say fuck it.
Well, I think it's just that they
Oftentimes,
don't represent a significant fraction of your actual mental space because your mental space is so crowded with like the main things, right? So
it's kind of like it's like a game jam in the sense that like while you're doing it, the dishes are piling up and everything else is still kind of happening.
Because everything actually is still falling apart, like you are still being additionally stressed by all the other stuff, right? It's a bottleneck thing, it's like all of your focus and energy and all that is like on the main thing. And so
it's a perspective thing, right? More than a bottleneck. Yeah. It's like, it's basically, if you only have a couple small things to be stressed about, I mean, it's almost like you have a certain amount of energy and those couple small things just then take all of it, right? But if you got like a really big, crazy thing to worry about, then all the small things are very obviously very small. So even though you might still be, they're on your radar or whatever else, they just don't quite hit. They just don't hit.
Yeah, they're just, it's just compared to the main thing. It's just,
So like in Flux's case, it's like, she had to save the world, which was pretty, and she of course had other shit going on, other loose ends, that needed tied up and stuff. But like, you got this one big thing. Actually, I guess in her case it was more, we got to get these packages delivered and I guess we'll save the world sort of, as a side effect, which became the main intent later. But like the initial goal was just to deliver some packages.
Well, actually, and too, when we made the cutscene, that was a couple of years ago now, actually, and that was also that was like the establishment time of trying to figure out really the core like thematic idea of what we were trying to do in the game's narrative arc and stuff too. And we basically have an inversion where in the original game it was all about like, I'm just a person trying to do my job. Like, I guess I'll save the world so that I can do my job, right? Which was in many ways the same thing that we had going on with us during that time, right? Just trying to make a game. Guess I gotta defeat cancer to do it. So okay, fine, I'll go do that and finish the game.
Just trying to get on with my life,
Yeah, but the pandemic was it was like a year and a half or something into that. And I remember what we talked about was like thematically the idea is almost like the opposite, which is recognizing in Flux's case, it's a question of what's important, right? You can continue working for the bureau for the rest of your life, stacking up all these things. Meanwhile, you haven't seen your friends
chasing
forever.
that paper.
Yeah, haven't seen your friends, haven't connected with your people. And so it was about actually that particular kind of feeling, which I think everybody was feeling very much at the time. And I think actually still is kind of thematically in there, being kind of over the grind culture and stuff like that. So it's basically the opposite of what the original games.
Well, and kind of in that same sort of pandemic metaphor, it kind of comes back to that like suspending your participation in the world for a while and then coming back and realizing that things aren't the same. Things have fallen apart quite a bit.
Well, it's not that they're falling apart. It's that they were always really bad, but it was the world you knew, right? And so getting that distance of having something not even exactly put on hold, but just change the shape of everything all of a sudden, right? Made it so that everyone's like looking at it being like, wait a second. We knew this wasn't like we knew it wasn't great. Right. But it was also a lot worse than a lot of people even thought. Right. And I think that's that same deal with Flux. It's like she's on the grind. She's working for a big corp, doesn't really give a shit about her. All they care about is that those packages get delivered, so she's worried about making sure she can do it. And that's her whole focus. And then as in that process, she's now trapped on a planet. Everything's going to shit. And then she suddenly has to be like, she's now in a survival situation. Right. Which isn't a good situation to be in. Right. But it's different, and it completely changes her perspective so that when she finally gets to leave, now the idea she's back on the grind, right? And actually, in many ways, much better off with the lore that we set up, right? But
not fulfilled.
But not fulfilled. Back, and now it's like very apparent, and it's easier to see, right? That hey, this stuff that I'm actually now better off than I ever was in the context that I came from, right? But it's now easier to see just how bad that context is.
Yeah. And also, in retrospect, I love how like in the first game where we did have the rescue party, Brad and Will come to, but they were there to rescue the packages. Right? Like they only had enough room in their rocket to get the packages and leave, and they're like, they'll send another ship probably to pick you guys up at some point, because like the whole point was the packages, and the company just does not give a shit about Flux and Juicebox, right? So we tried to really sort of connect like an emotional thread to the original game, but also to just like what has been going on in the world and in people's lives between the first game and this game, and how do we kind of create sort of a connecting through line, with that. So
I mean, the first game really was about like you being on your grind, right? And like no matter what, powering it out in many ways. Like you don't need to rely on people much, in the original game. And then this game is literally the whole like core design premise is that you find friends and you use the power of essentially the power of friendship to unlock your recipes and really become strong enough by virtue of having your ties with people, as opposed to being like a solo, character that you're able to do great things. And it's just a very different premise.
Yeah. And in Crashlands, you can also kind of see how like the building out your base in the first Crashlands really was like building a base. It's just like, it's a place to kind of just like touch back and
have all your stuff.
It's your stuff. Check a couple of boxes. Most people use a pretty like utilitarian approach to building their base. And in Crashlands 2, the angle is more about building a home and like building a family, like a found family kind of a thing. So, it's, I think, the game really reflects kind of like a lot of changes in perspective and all of that. But then the cutscene kind of, I think Sam did a great job of putting that thing together to animate that and get that storytelling, wrapped up. But also I want to say, and we had kind of mentioned this when we were recording yesterday, and we got interrupted, but I still have to reiterate that Sam made that cutscene in Spine, and it's fucking crazy. So Spine is like, it's a 2D animation tool that people use for like, oftentimes you can tell when somebody's used Spine in like a Unity game or whatever, because of it's like a skeletal animation tool where you'll take a bunch of different images and then you kind of create a bones in this thing. And then, those images can rotate or scale or whatever. And oftentimes you'll see a 2D animation in a game where it very clearly is like, they're just kind of like rotating the limbs around in a way that doesn't feel very fluid. And you're just like, oh, that's Spine. Like Spine was used to make this animation. But it's in a lot of ways, it's kind of like when people talk about, oh, like I can tell an AI generated image, right? It's like, no, you can tell the ones that are obviously AI generated, right? Ones that are really good, you can't fucking tell, right? And so it's like, if an animation is done really well in Spine, you can't tell that Spine was used to make it. And so I just want to give a shout out to Sam that like he made like how many minutes is the cutscene? It's like 2 minutes.
It's long.
It's one Spine animation. It's one Spine file that Sam made and animated this straight through.
There's hundreds of drawings in that thing, and that was it took like 8 weeks or so, roughly, start to finish.
Yeah. And now I have to say, why did we use? Because like there's a lot of ways that you can make videos, right? Like you can use Flash or you can use various
we're all
Adobe
about
things
tools,
and stuff.
so it seems insane that you'd be like your choice. Was
why
that.
would we use Spine? And the reason is that at the time that we started working on the cutscene, Game Maker did not have video support. So you couldn't just like play it. Like there were a couple plugins that only worked on Windows, I think, that like some Game Maker users made extensions. So we're like, well, the only way for us to actually play this cutscene is if it's literally a sprite. like a Spine sprite in the game that we can just play as a Spine animation. Now the amount of textures that it ended up having was fucking crazy because it's a 2-minute cutscene with like full screen visuals and stuff.
Jacked the RAM up by like a half a gig or something like that. It was just
yeah, it was crazy.
Break the game sometimes. Yeah, sweet.
So just as luck would have it, I think like it would take like 6 weeks to put that together.
8 weeks, I think, to put it together.
8 weeks, to create and animate that cutscene in Spine, and then like on week 6 or something, Game Maker got an update that added video support. So Sam was almost done making this thing in Spine, so that he finished it in Spine and then just recorded video.
I recorded the video of it playing in engine in Game Maker.
In Game Maker, yeah. So we still booted it up in Game Maker, played it as a Spine animation, recorded it, and then turned it into an MP4 or whatever.
Not the best workflow path,
But again, it's just one of those like, hey, you got what you got. You got the tools you got. Fucking just go. You can wring your hands about it all day. And
well, it's really one of those
Sometimes
things.
you
Like,
gotta do stuff the weird way. It's just
yeah,
like-
you can. If you want to talk about just animating stuff, like it actually is the case that the whole animation process was very easy because it was in Spine, right? As in getting everything in, keying it all out, whatever. The thing that you
but
don't
also
have any
you
access
know how
to.
to animate stuff in Spine, right?
Oh
So-
yeah. But I'm saying like as far as like moving pieces around, right? The thing you basically just don't have any access to at all is transitions. There's
Scene-
no
like scene transitions,
Yeah,
like
there's
what
no
you would do in,
manipulation, no like fancy shit where you can like fade something in with like a cool effect or something like that. So
I guess if you were to do it again now, would you? Because there's two then solutions there,
Mhm.
right? One is you create individual scenes as like individual Spine projects, right? So that to get around the problem with like
Yeah,
the
export
problem is
certain parts of it.
transitions. Yeah, do the stuff that doesn't require transition because then you can use it to animate and all that kind of stuff, right? And now you have a whole bunch of projects that each one of which is a scene, and then you go into video editor to stitch it together
Mhm.
with your transitions and stuff, right? So would you take doing it again? Would you take that approach, or would it be all in some kind of a video based?
yeah, I
like
don't know. That's the
animation
tricky part.
suite.
Because I think, I mean, if they did it in something, you'd probably do it in After Effects if I was going to do it again.
Yep.
As far as like, because it's not like Toon Boom things where I'm trying to animate it in a video tool, if that makes sense. I'd still prefer to do the drawings in one place, like in Clip Studio, and then get them exported for like that part of the pipeline. So you probably do something like if you want to have more access to interesting effects and stuff, I'd probably do it in After Effects. But that said, again, there's some value in having it have to be simple in certain ways, right? Because it doesn't allow you to fall into super deep, like tweaking rabbit holes about like a very particular ways things are functioning because you literally can't get them to do that. So you just kind of have to focus on the core of it, which honestly is kind of nice given the scale of the studio and stuff. It's like, and I don't like taking 2.5 minutes for one person to make one person making a 2.5 minute cutscene in 8 weeks feels like pretty fucking good time, especially given.
And it was
that
the first
turned out
one
well.
we've ever done. It's like,
Yeah.
So the only janky part of it really ended up being the fact that if Sam wanted to capture video of the Spine animation, playing it in Spine doesn't really work because Spine has all these extra like little graphical overlays and stuff, and you can't just like full screen play a Spine animation because it's not how it works. So we would still end up like if we make another cutscene, we would still have to probably
put it in
bring
a player,
it into
basically.
GameMaker as a Spine file and then play the video and capture it. So still kind of dumb, but still probably fine.
Honestly, yeah. Good.
Yeah. But yeah, so the whole reason though that we released this cutscene on YouTube was because we are also releasing a playable demo soon.
Mhm.
To exact date to be announced.
TBD.
But
and we'll say it's going to be when it does release. It'll be released for a short period of time. So
just
it's-
on Steam.
yeah, but not so short that like if you blink you'll miss it.
yeah, but short enough that like you won't be able to just to play the demo up until launch. That's the idea.
Yeah. So when it comes to the demo, essentially, we're going into some marketing efforts to kind of like, build some more hype around the game. And part of that is getting it into players' hands, but also getting it into the hands of streamers and YouTubers and stuff like that. And once those people start playing it, then the opening cutscene will, like, people will see it, right? And so we're like, well, we want this cutscene to stand on its own as a really cool sort of like marketing item and like a promotional thing that people can just like can watch in isolation. And if the first time it goes out into the world will be sort of like baked into people's Twitch streams or whatever, then that can kind of take away from people's ability to kind of like just appreciate the cutscene just for itself, right? And so it's like, well, given that, we're going to have probably people streaming the demo and seeing the cutscene and broadcasting the cutscene at some point in the very near future, let's just get ahead of it and put it out ourselves. So that way it's there and people can see it. So we'll kind of have some more info on the demo as the dates get more locked down and the plan gets more locked down. But there's something else I want to talk about with the demo, which is keyboards.
Oh no!
Okay.
This is localization again.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, and to back it up a little bit, because we're releasing a demo, that means it has to be a polished, production ready to go version of the game. Just a short form of it, right? Which means all the problems you have to solve at some point before launch. Like,
might as well do them now.
Yep.
and we got to do them now.
Kind of
Right?
gotta.
Yeah. Yeah. And and we kind of have I would say perfectionism, but like we have a pretty high standard of, we want to get rid of as much jank as we can. Right. And so if a player picks up the game and there's something that we could have resolved, with like a couple hours or a day of work, that thing gives them a bad experience, we would prefer to just do that before the demo comes out. So
Part of the reasoning is actually a scale thing too, which is that if you're going to have, like, I don't know how many people are actually going to play the demo, but even if it's just like 1,000 people, right, for the first time playing the game, I don't want to get choked up with so many comments that are just the same comment of a thing that we already knew was janky. That's actually like 90% of it for me, is like, I want to get that shit out of the way so that any feedback we get is actual feedback about the experience of the game, not, my keyboard hotkeys don't work, or whatever.
It's kind of like, if I don't walk the dogs in the morning, then they're super restless the rest of the day and they won't stop harassing me about it. Right. And it's like, sometimes you just got to take a minute in advance, fix a thing, and then you just won't hear about it anymore. Right.
Well, especially for this kind of an early thing too, right? Because that also means that the stuff that's publicly visible of people talking about the game and that kind of stuff, right? If there are just like a handful of like friction points that we knew were there that everyone's going to comment on and be annoyed about, right? Then that also, because the negative stuff always outweighs the positive stuff. So even if 1 out of 100 comments that a streamer says about the game is negative, like, it's going to feel like half of the comments were negative, right?
Yeah.
So having that degree of polish is actually really important.
Yeah. And like if there's people who just end up not liking the game because it's not their kind of game or whatever the case may be, that's fine. Right. But yeah, if there's something that's just universally bad for everybody, then we don't want that. So we're taking the time to do stuff like we've added colorblind options. So, we have the friendly and hostile telegraph colors on the ground for like hitting enemies or avoiding attacks and stuff. Those are customizable now because, we know that about 5% of our players are going to have some form of color blindness, and we want to make sure that they have a good time, right? And so another extension of that is we've talked in the past about all these challenges with localization, and we really just kind of talked about the primary challenges of portraying information, right? Of like, how do you get the text in the game? How do you work with the translators? How do you do all that stuff? But something that we didn't mention before because we didn't really know about it, we didn't thought that deeply about it, is keyboards. Okay,
oh man.
So here's what we had dealt with this past week. So our localization QA people came back to us and they were like, "Hey, trying to rebind my keys in Chinese, and it's not, just doesn't work. Nothing's happening. Can't do it." And then they're like, and then also I switched to Spanish, and like some of the keys that I bind just show there's just the wrong key. Like I'll try to bind something, I'll hit like the Nye, which is the N with the little squiggly over it, and it's
a square bracket or something.
It's a tilde instead, right? And so we're like, oh right. Different keyboards around the world will have different visuals at the same location, right? So like in a QWERTY keyboard where the semicolon is, that's where the Nye is in Spanish, right? And so our initial thought was like, oh, we just need to figure out visually sort of what is at that position on the keyboard, and then just figure out what language they're in and show the correct text or whatever that's going to be on that button, because that's what you would think, right? Like it's just a positional remapping.
Yeah, it's not. You don't have more keys. Keyboards are the same.
Right? Oh, you do.
Well,
yeah.
So this thing.
So this is
the keyboard layout though is the same, right? Like the physical layout.
No,
it's
similar. It's similar.
It's
yeah. So
similar.
So here's where the rabbit hole started, right? Because so first off, we're like, okay, what's even happening behind the scenes when you push a button on a keyboard? How does the computer know what you're trying to do, right? So for example, the A key is number 65. So when I hit A, the keyboard actually just says to the computer, "Hey, key number 65 got pushed."
Actually, that's not.
It's a It's a virtual key.
That's almost what happens. That's what actually happens is the keyboard sends what's called a scan code, which is
We'll get there. Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like it makes more sense
that's
to
the
talk
middle
about
layer.
the full route, right? No, that's the intro layer because the keyboard sends when you hit that key in that position, it's a hardware thing, right? The keyboard, no matter what you're doing, that keyboard when you hit a certain key will send the same scan code for that key. Right. And if you take
like key, you're saying the physical key.
The physical key. If I
So
push
if I hit
it,
the button where the A key is on my keyboard.
Yeah.
If
or maybe a better example.
Button, then it sends the
well,
same.
so a better example is QWERTY versus AZERTY. Okay. So like in English keyboards in the US, we have QWERTY on the top row, right? French keyboard uses AZERTY, AZERTY. So
and a
where
handful
you have
of
a
other
Q,
locales also do.
yeah. So where you have a Q in French, they'll have an A, and where you have a W, they'll have a Z, right?
Okay.
So if you press that Q button, if a French person presses the A button, they're pressing the same spot,
The same
position,
physical key, right?
the same physical key, but for you it has just a Q on it. For them, it has an A on it.
So they both send the same scan code. It's like the hard
because it's the same position.
Yeah.
Okay.
On the keyboard. Yeah. Okay. So scan codes are basically a positional mapping. So if you just like took away all the letters and stuff on your keyboard, and then instead replaced them with the scan code numbers, and then somebody from another country also put scan code numbers, your keyboards would look the same.
Okay.
It's like exactly the same.
Yeah, so you kind of think of it as like the text that's written on your keyboard keys is independent actually of what the hardware is doing, right?
Yeah.
Because the part that makes it dependent is then the next layer, which is the driver layer, which is the thing on your operating system that captures those scan codes as they come in and says, what does this map onto?
What does this mean?
Gotcha.
Which is
so it's
right?
like, oh,
that's where we get the so it's like I got scan code 10 or whatever, and then the driver's like, okay, well I'm the US keyboard driver, right? And so for me, that 10 means Q or whatever, right?
Yeah. Okay. So
if you're gonna switch keyboard layouts, what you're actually doing, like on your computer, is you're actually switching drivers, so that now the scan codes come in and are like, oh, well, now that I'm on the French driver, that same 10 that you just pressed, I now interpret as an A.
Yes. Okay. So that means though that the scan codes all come through the same, but what the game reads is not the scan code. The game reads the virtual key code, which is what the driver converts the scan code into.
Right.
Okay.
So that's why if you
like
start switching what your layout is on your operating system, you're like, actually, I'm using French now. The scan codes are the same, still coming in the whole time, but what the game gets now is a different code.
It's a different
virtual
number.
key code. Yeah.
Is the French one. This is what you want, right? Like it would get.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
It gets the one you want, except the weird problem then is the virtual keys are not positionally mapped. Okay. So like in Spanish, I was saying how the ñe is semicolon, right? And your pipe key on your keyboard. In Spanish, that's actually where your tilde is on a QWERTY keyboard, and your tilde is where the pipe is. Okay, and the virtual key codes for those three keys are scrambled on a Spanish keyboard compared to yours. So if I push that same button, the computer now gets a different virtual key code, which means it's positionally in the wrong spot. So when we're creating key maps, we think about hand positions, right? Like where are my fingers when I push this button? Well, if the virtual keys get moved around, even though the scan codes are the same, then now the positional mapping is wrong, and so like your hand position actually does not match
because we have a different
US
need.
Keyboard. Well, yeah, on the US keyboard, you'd be like, I want WASD, right? That's like, and you actually want that equivalent.
But you don't
thing.
care that it's WASD. You care about that hand position. Yeah.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. And so for you, your A is where your ring finger is when you're holding WASD, right? If you switch to an AZERTY keyboard, suddenly the computer's like, oh, your A key is now up one row, right? Because we're not mapping scan codes, we're mapping virtual keys because that's the actual input number that we get.
So you have to go back. You have to read it and then.
But if you don't know what keyboard is being used, right?
Then you
Then there's no way for you to know, right? Because if all you have, because all we get is the virtual keys on our side, right? So we'll get the letter A basically, right?
Yeah. So the game is like, hey, A got pushed, but we don't know whether that A is on a WSD or whether it's in the top left corner or if it's in the bottom.
yeah.
Like we don't know where the fuck that A is.
And it's
on
a
the
little more
keyboard.
complicated than that too, because there are some of those virtual key codes that also map on to different characters, right? So, like for the most part, the letter A, like the English text A, right,
will always come through as A.
will always come through.
It just moves
as
around on the keyboard.
Say the same virtual key code.
Okay.
It comes from a different spot on the keyboard, but like comes with the same virtual key code, and it represents the same character A, right? But in certain languages that like don't use the letter A at all, say like Russian, right? You're going to actually have the same virtual key code that normally corresponds to A on a US keyboard. Right?
But it's just something else now.
It's just something else, right? And so there's basically there's several layers here. And if you're dealing with keyboard inputs for text input, like somebody just writing something, right? You have a different set of problems. That's basically what stuff is mostly geared for, because the whole point of a keyboard most of the time is to be able to send text in, right?
To type
To
stuff.
type stuff.
Yeah.
And so that's why what we get on the game. That's why the operating system basically intercepts stuff before it basically the operating system handles all the positional stuff and it abstracts it away. And it's like, you don't care. You don't care what these keys are, where they are, etc. All you care about is like
Is what key got pressed.
what the key was, what the characters that you're supposed to have, right?
When you're dealing with a video game, you're essentially saying
You care about
this
position.
This is not a typing tool anymore. This is a controller for a video game.
Exactly.
Which means the position is the only thing that matters. So now we got to figure out how to reverse engineer which key not just which key you press. We know that, but where
where it is.
on the board is that supposed key?
But it's actually both. We have to figure out where on the board. So we got to figure out if we say like, okay, we're going to base all of our decisions on the initial mapping that is based on a US keyboard. So we decide WSD is the initial movement, et cetera, right? And now we need to figure out when the user comes in to hit a key, when they're looking at like
At the key binding interface.
at the key binding interface, or they're looking at some of their interfaces that shows like an enter above a button or something, right? When we're showing people stuff, we have to make sure we're showing them what actually matches with their keyboard.
right, because you could
Right.
accidentally.
So that's one thing we have to do.
mess up.
And which is a separate problem, but related to the problem of what
Where
keys
is it?
actually positionally make the most sense for that user, so that
Yeah.
the WSD sort of style mapping is also what they're getting, even if that corresponds to different
Something
keys.
else.
Both of those are separate problems that we have to
Yeah.
solve.
Cool.
All right,
cool,
so
cool,
here's
cool, cool.
so here's then what we had to. So first we had to figure out that all this stuff even exists. Okay,
Something we just never thought about
step
before.
one.
right?
yeah, because all I've ever known is like when somebody pushes a button on the keyboard, Game Maker just gets like 12. It's like, all right, well I know that 12 is W or whatever, right? And so and I don't really care that 12 is W. It's just that if I want to show somebody what the key bind is, like on their hotbar or something, then I need to know that so I can show it, right? So all I've ever operated with is just those key codes. And it didn't even occur to me that on other keyboards, they would just be scrambled around in just totally different places or correspond to just a totally different letter or character. And so first was just us recognizing like, okay, this is how this works. There's the scan code layer, which is positions, and then there's virtual keys, which do not match positions. And also then
It's
like
language
you need to,
dependent,
and it's language dependent. So it's multiple layers. So what we've had to do then over this past week is compile information about which keyboards are popular based on which languages we have. Because any given language may have up to like 6 or 7 different keyboard layouts, but usually there's like a dominant one.
There's
That's
basically a
99%,
dominant one most of the time, and maybe for some language there's like a secondary one that's also pretty popular. But for the most part, that's kind of as far as it goes, right?
Yeah. So, for example, like in the US, you can use a programmer's Dvorak keyboard or a Dvorak keyboard or a QWERTY, but like just use QWERTY.
Yeah.
Because
And, like,
everybody
and-
uses QWERTY.
And a few
right? So-
percent of people use Dvorak, right? It's like,
Yeah.
it's going to be one of the most and there's like Colmac and a few other ones, right? Those are the most popular of the non-popular.
unpopular ones.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
But collectively, they represent 0 people, basically, right?
Yeah. So, so first we got to go through each language that we're supporting and figure out what's the keyboard layout that we need. Then we needed to figure out what the key mappings are for the virtual keys and like how they display characters associated with those things.
So that we can,
so we-
so that's to map the visual layer, right? So that when,
Yeah.
so that when we say like, okay, we're in Spanish, we just got the number 65, then now we know like, oh, that corresponds to, this Spanish character.
That's an enye or whatever, right? Which it isn't there on a QWERTY keyboard, but we have to display it, right? So we did that, and then we started doing some more experiments. We're like, yeah, but we still have this positional problem because if we got a WASD, gaming setup, and then somebody boots up the game and they switch to the Azerty keyboard, the French keyboard.
That's just a weird setup now. You can't.
Then it'll display the keybinds correctly, but the keybinds won't be where we want them to be. They will have moved around, right? And so then we had to do this extra step, which is go back through all those keyboards and compile a lookup table of how their scan codes map onto the virtual key numbers. Okay. So that way we know where each virtual key is with relation to each scan code. And now what we haven't yet done, that'll be my Monday morning project, is make it so that whenever somebody goes from one keyboard layout to another in the game, that we convert their current keybinds to scan codes. So we convert those to positions on the keyboard. Then we switch to the other keyboard and then convert those positions back to keybinds and rebind all their keys to those new codes.
Yeah,
right?
and so that, and you might be like asking like, well, people don't change their keyboards very often, so why do we care about that? Right? And the answer is actually because we do need it for that also, but it's actually because we need a starting point. So our starting point is the US keyboard, and that's what everything's in, right? And so when the user first boots up the game, we'll then detect like, oh, it turns out they're on a French keyboard, right? So it's not that they've changed their keyboard. It's just that they've changed from how we've defined everything.
Baseline.
Right?
Yeah. So that
it was quite the rabbit hole.
It was really interesting.
Kept getting
and
deeper.
It's just and it's also it's interesting, especially as you dig through a lot of language stuff, just how much of it is not down to conventional decision making where somebody would be like, this would be the best way to do this. It's more about what options you have available given where you're at. So for like the most interesting thing,
and for interoperability, right? Was the other big thing.
So like the most interesting thing that we dealt with to me was CJK languages: Chinese, Japanese, Korean.
Yeah. How do you type when you have 2,000?
When you've got thousands of characters,
right? Yeah.
Great question, Sam. So interestingly, in those countries, they use a US QWERTY keyboard. Okay. They just use the same keyboard that we use. But they use it pretty differently when they're typing because they have this extra layer in the OS that's called an IME, which I didn't actually look up what that stands for, but it's essentially an interface layer where when they start to type using QWERTY, they're essentially typing sort of phonetically words in their language and spelling it out in the characters that we use in our alphabet. And this extra layer will look at what they're typing and give them options of words or phrases in their language to convert it into.
It's basically searching for their characters. The actual symbol, right, to use as opposed to
basically. Yeah. So it's like you can think of it as like because we have like one interception layer from keyboard to your
scan
application, right,
codes.
which is scan code gets intercepted by the driver, which converts it to a virtual key code, right? And then now if you're in CJK and because you don't have to have these things turned on, right? So if you're in CJK and you have your IME turned on, then the operating system adds another interception layer where it now takes those initial virtual key codes that are being generated by the driver, captures them, and then gives a new interface to the user to then convert those things into some new set of characters, right? That then finally gets sent to the application.
Yeah,
right?
I mean,
that is a huge problem for games because, again, in games, we care about the position of the thing you type. We don't give a shit about the input.
About the word that you type.
Yes.
Like, we don't even take words. We take key presses. So the problem is with the IME layer, the IME just always sends the same key code, no matter what. So if you have the IME turned on, it only sends key code 229. Period. No matter what key you press, that thing intercepts it first, and then it gives you 229. Okay, so you actually can't read hotkeys for gaming when that layer is active, right? And if you're thinking about this kind of in retrospect, you're like, why would these countries do this? Like, why would they use a QWERTY keyboard and do all these weird extra layers? And it's like, well, it all just depends on where they were at in relation to the tech at the time. And like, you know, if they had invented the keyboard and the computer in one of those countries, then maybe we would have something like an IME over here where we would have a transition layer, right? And so it's not that it's like the preferred way to do it. It's just that's how it kind of evolved in the ecosystem over time.
And that's where that interop problem comes in, right? Is because the operating systems that are available are operating on the assumption that there's a keyboard with a driver, that scan codes are coming in, being converted into virtual key codes, right? Like all of it's built under that first set of assumptions. And so if you're trying to now add the stuff that your language needs on top of existing technology, then it's like, well, shit.
Just add a layer.
So your two options are basically like add a new keyboard driver, but that's very limited because it's only it's however many keys the keyboard's got, right? That's all you can really do with that. Or you add an entirely new layer to the system to do another round of stuff, right?
Yeah. Now, also, I watched. Have you guys watched Three Body Problem?
Yeah,
Yes.
I've been watching it.
So there's a great scene in the first episode where there's a character, and I guess I'm thinking about this now. There's a character in the show who is who's typing into a computer in Chinese, and this is like in the 70s. Except in order to do it, she has a giant book, book of Chinese characters, and there's numerical codes that you type in and then hit enter to submit that character to the computer. And so for her to type a message, for each letter, she's got to like flip to pages of a book, figure out what the number is, type the number, flip to another page,
which is
type
again,
that number.
That is what we're doing when we use a keyboard, right? Is you're hitting the key that sends the number 10 and that maps onto the letter A or whatever, right? So like it's the same idea,
Chinese,
but there's so many fucking characters to be represented that you can't just have a keyboard to press.
Yeah. And so the IME is, in my mind, it's actually a very elegant, layer in between there, which is like boiled down.
It's a human focused kind of way of managing that, right?
Yeah. It's human focused, but in a way that still meets the tech and still lets you type stuff into a computer, even though you've only got a handful of keys available, right? And so we also had to find some way to like develop an extension to have the game tell the computer, hey, don't use the IME layer while this app is focused. Because that way we can actually capture keystrokes from a person who's using an IME without having it turn into garbled gibberish, right?
And even that was interesting too, because we ran into this question, which is like, do Chinese, Japanese, Korean players know, or like, is this a common thing where like, the first question we even had was
how it works?
Can games disable this, right?
Yep.
Or do players just know in those locales that, like when I'm playing a video game, I turn off my IME. That's just part of the process, right? And so when we first started like doing it, we were just like, oh shit. So like the first thing that we did was we just were like, well, when we detect that scan code or that key code that Seth mentioned that indicates that the IME is being used, right? Then we would just be like, we would just tell the user, hey, this isn't going to work. Turn off your IME, right? So that was our first pass at the thing. And then sure, booted up a few games in his Steam library that were, one of them in particular was made by a Japanese developer, I think. And he was like, whatever they're doing, that's got to be state of the art, kind of a thing, right? So he booted that up and then saw that like the IME is just disabled, but only while you're in the game. So like if you tab back to your browser or something and then start typing again, IME comes up, right? So then we basically discovered by looking at what other people did, okay, there must be a way for us to like disable this only in the game, right? And then
that's an expectation probably on the player base's front, so you're good to do so.
Yeah. So that's the expectation, and really we need to, because while probably a lot of players, especially PC gamers, are gonna get it. They'll be like, oh, this isn't working. It's probably my IME. It's gonna be one of the classic things, probably, right? We want also the game to be played by younger people and people who might be less familiar with that, and it should also match state of the art, ideally, right? But it was interesting because Sure kind of figured it out, but then quickly ran into another interesting wrinkle, which was it's a Steam game, which means it has the Steam overlay, right? But the Steam overlay still lives in the application. It comes in through the Steam SDK, which is baked into the game, right? So then he would like Alt Tab
or Shift Tab,
whatever it is. Yeah, Shift Tab,
which opens the Steam overlay.
Open up Steam overlay, and the IME is still disabled, which means now if he wants to go like type something into Steam, like type a message to somebody, search something in the Steam store, whatever, right? Then he can't
type anymore.
It's just all disabled. And so then he had to come. I don't know. I know he said he figured it out. So I don't know how he figured it out.
He solved it somehow. He's crafty.
Yeah, but so he figured out that basically what he had to do was make it so that the game disables the IME for itself while it's running, unless you open up the Steam overlay, in which case it turns it back on. And then when you come back, it somehow turns it back off again.
So this was
Wow.
Yeah. This is just it's a fascinating can of worms. Or it's even crazier because we released Levelhead in 12 languages, and
including CJK.
Nobody said anything about this. And I think part of it is most people use a controller to play Levelhead.
Yeah, I was gonna say because controllers get you around this problem in the same way that a touchscreen gets you around this problem because it's a unified interface. It doesn't change based on
Yeah. So really the problem is keyboards. And also a game that has enough keybinds with the keyboard that it matters, because also in Levelhead, there's just not that many.
Yeah, if you have to go
keys,
rebind it.
There's not that many hotkeys.
And I assume also part of the experience is for most people who play games that are made by like basically indies, English-speaking indies, then I assume a big part of the experience is like you pop up in the settings to go change the keybinds.
Yeah, you just assume
you just kind of assume they're wrong.
That it's not going to work for you out of the gate. Yeah.
Yeah, but that does mean that like depending on which keybinds people hit, they may have hit a key and then it just shows the wrong thing on their keybinding menu, right?
Yep.
But it is also the case that many of the keys that do get kind of scrambled around are some of those edge keys, they're like that are just different, right? So like semicolon, right? You're probably not going to keybind something to semicolon,
right?
But that key is one that gets changed a lot in different languages to just other things completely, right? So yeah, I mean, it's just a.
Well, I think it's also an important reminder too, right? That like as people living in the United States, where the United States is responsible for so much of the technology that we use, right? Mm-hmm. Then it's all built for us. And it's built for the technology we use, right? So that stuff just works basically out of the gate. And this is true. Like most of the games that we play are made by US or Canadian developers, or right. So like everything when we boot up a game, like there's none of this stuff that is a surprise where we're like, oh shit, oh right, because I'm an English speaker, right? I'm gonna have to go do X, Y, and Z, right? But if
this is the concept of privilege, right?
Exactly.
Where it's like because the world is made for you, you don't ever have to think about changing things to make yourself fit into the world.
Not even aware of the problem, right? But if you're a French player or who like is going to be using a ZERTY as a keyboard, right? Mm-hmm. Like you're going to be used to the idea that if you go boot up a game, there's a really good chance that
nobody has thought about you.
Yeah, that nobody has thought about you, and that when you go to press WASD, equivalent, right? Then the character doesn't behave the way you expect. So like, okay, so you're just like, oh, right. So then you go in your key binds and then you start entering in your new bindings and see different characters than the ones that you think you're typing. And you'll be like, oh, right, I've seen this before.
That just happens.
Right. And like, so you're going to go through this cascade of like shitty experiences, but it's happened to you a million times. And so it's like, it's tedious and it sucks, but also
that's just life.
Yeah. It basically means that we're just by the developers who then are putting out those products in that state, right? Are basically just saying like, oh yeah, you'll deal with the bullshit. So like, we don't have to deal with it.
I mean, if they're saying that at all, I think it's,
exactly. Yeah,
it's hardly that. It's probably more so even just like not even knowing that it's a thing that people
don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what it sounds like to me.
Well, and that's also because then he asked the question, like, how come we didn't hear about this from Levelhead players, right? Because the problems are there. And the answer is a combination of like you said, it's keyboards aren't the primary input mechanism. Mm-hmm. Popularity questions in different parts of the world, right? That kind of stuff, right? But then also, there's just a really good chance that all the players impacted by it were just like, "Oh, I've seen this before," whatever. And so they go fix it. And and rather than come tell us that this was a problem, they just
assume that's the nature of things.
They just dealt with it, right? Because they assume that's the nature of things.
Yeah, which is also kind of
then you don't hear about it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as far as kind of like the privilege conversation goes, it also kind of shows how like if somebody's just so accustomed to just being on the bad end of the deal, and they're just so fucking exhausted from having to just always like deal with these micro problems, they're just like, it would be such a waste of my time to even speak up about this.
Yeah, especially if you can just go fix it, so you just go fix it.
Yeah, like I'll just deal with it, I'll fix it and just move on with my life, right? And so it creates this weird like apathy loop on both ends where like the people who get hit by the problem are so used to it, they're just over it. And the people who are causing the problem because they don't know that it's a problem will never know that it's a problem.
And if they do hear about it, they're not going to hear about it very much, right?
Yeah. And so it sounds like an edge case. They're like, oh, maybe this one person is just weirdly, sensitive about this one aspect of the game. Who cares, right? Because if we got like a million players and one of them is talking about a keyboard layout in another language, you're like, well, I don't know. Maybe they got some weird hardware thing going. There's so many ways you could kind of explain it away.
I think it always comes down to, I think, an investment question, right? Because the reality is like what you just described as far as unspooling the technology stack and the kind of insane complexity of the problems that you're having to then basically reverse engineer so that you can make this work correctly for people has to be the dev effort that goes into that has to be always threaded through a lens of like, does it impact the reality as far as like, will it make people buy the game more? Does it matter? Right? Does it matter from a like dollars range, right?
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting framing.
That's where it gets
because
tricky, right?
In my mind, I think that's the method of decision making in a larger studio.
Yes, I agree.
Right, which is like you got to think about your return on your investment for everything that you're working on for development. But I think the problem is, and I think we saw this with Baldur's Gate, which is the actual currency between a developer and their players is goodwill.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's the thing that creates a sustainable studio is having fans who want to buy the next thing that you make because they feel like they're being respected and thought of. Right. And if you take that time to do that, then you can't put a dollar amount. Nobody's going to not buy the game because you didn't have the proper keybinds, because how would they even know that when they bought it?
But I think that's a good point though, because I think while it's true in a long arc of things, it's also very true that a studio does not run on goodwill. So it doesn't matter if you did.
It does though. Like
it doesn't matter if you let's say you take a lot of extra time to like fully internationalize a thing, right? But it's a game that you didn't. The game's not very good. It doesn't matter that you did all this internet. It's like the end of the pipe, right? It doesn't matter.
You still have to make a good game that people want to buy. That's what I'm saying.
It's like when you have limited time, the reality is again this comes down. It's an accessibility thing, right? It's always the thing. Same thing with accessibility options, whatever. It's like they are things that when essentially like. If you're taking investment time, you're investing time and energy into doing them. But if you're doing that on top of a core product that doesn't do its job still in the basis and like the actual reason why someone would buy it sense, then it doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter that you're like generating goodwill if nobody plays the game because you didn't invest enough into the art or whatever else, assuming these are like choices you're making, right? About.
Yeah. I'm taking it as an assumption that you're making a quality game that is well thought out in terms of its mechanics and stuff like that. But to me it's kind of the same as like lacing a game with microtransactions, right? Mm-hmm. And like one of my WoW guild mates at one point previously was like she said, "Man, I would so love to have a game like Baldur's Gate, but in the Warcraft universe." And my immediate response was, that will literally never happen because you can't make a game like Baldur's Gate and lace it with in-app purchases and have a good experience. And nowadays, Blizzard is, they're a publicly traded company. Well, I guess they're acquired now, so they're an investment vehicle for Microsoft.
Yeah, their structure wouldn't allow it. Basically, there's no way.
Yeah, I should have forgot that Microsoft bought them.
Yeah, so they have to make whatever decision pulls the most money out of players, not what gives players the best experience. And what that does is it creates an adversarial relationship between the players and the devs, right? And so when it comes to stuff like not having accessibility options, like we talked about the field of view slider and
right.
in Starfield, right? Those things are, in my mind, like they're not adversarial, but they're kind of neutral in the sense that you as the developer didn't go out of your way to make the player's experience worse so you could get money, but you also didn't do anything to make their experience better, right? And over time, I feel like those things just chip away at people's willing. Like I didn't buy Starfield.
Oh yeah.
Because I heard about all the stuff that happened with Fallout 76, and I was like, you know what? I don't trust these people anymore, right? I don't think they actually have they don't actually give a shit about whether I'm having fun or having a good experience playing their game. And that could turns out I was maybe right about that.
And that could be either through disdain, which is I think where you get your like laced microtransactions, right? Where you feel a disdain from the what the
like
game,
the devs are begrudgingly making a game so that they can put in do it.
And of course, individual devs isn't really what they're doing. They're just doing what they are being forced to do, right? And in those like larger enterprises, right? But the feeling that you get as a player though is that it's that the people making this thing for you have literal disdain for you as a human being, right? And then the other layer is the indifference one, and that's where all this other stuff comes into play. Where if you're playing the game and it doesn't feel like the game's going out of its way to make your experience bad, but like I said, it's not going out of its way either to like think of you as a human being, right? Then that's where you get that sense of it being indifferent towards you.
Yeah. And so there's these little things like the keyboard stuff where like if you're a French player and you boot up Crashlands 2 and you know what? The fucking key bindings are correct and you didn't have to do anything about it, right? Like that might be the first time you've experienced that. And you'll think, man, I didn't even know this was an option. Like I really like I feel seen. I feel like this studio actually gives a shit about me because you know what we do, right? Like we want you to be able to get into the game and just have a great time without having to go through a bunch of bullshit hoops, right? And I do think that, like in the short term, you can't be like, this like 2 days of dev time into this keyboard thing is going to net us $1,300. You know, like you can't do that. But the value to the studio of long-term fans who recognize that we actually give a shit about them, like the value of that just cannot be measured.
Yeah, right? I mean, I totally agree with that. I think it's the sort of thing that the baseline thing that you have to have in place already before you can care about these things, if that makes sense. Just as an entity that has to survive in these contexts.
Well, and you have to be able to know about these things. You have
there's a lot that you
it's
have
very
to have
hard.
in place. That's why I don't you know, if I boot up a game and there's just like a bunch of wacky shit going on in it, which is frankly most of the time.
Yeah. Especially if you're playing indie stuff.
Yeah, it's not that I assume that someone doesn't give a shit about me, if that makes sense, so much as that it's the case that they didn't have the capacity to do more.
Yeah, I would think of it as
like
a ratcheting.
product, right?
Yeah, I would like to that point. I would think it was like a ratcheting fidelity thing, right? Because like if I boot up a game and let's say it's a game made by a Japanese developer, right, and it's fully localized into English, like fully, and it and like when I first start playing, I don't actually realize that I'm playing a game made by a developer from a different locale, right? Then at that point, the fidelity is high enough that like. If they then like drop the ball on certain things and like now I'm like I have to like go remap my inputs and that kinds of stuff, right? Like that's where it feels like I'm not being thought of despite there being resources available.
I think it's that final one. That's why Starfield is so annoying because you're like, we know that you have literally
it's a AAA studio with ungodly.
So how dare you? You know?
Yeah. And that's why that's when I get the most offended by playing something where I can tell something that matters to me wasn't considered, you know, and it's always when I know they could have, so that it's so that I know it was actually a decision not to, right?
Yeah, well, because you can imagine like if there's 300 people working on this game, at some point, something like a map or a field of view slider would have come up, and then there would have been 3 or 4 meetings about the cost of implementing it.
Somebody decided no, right?
And somebody said, you know what, fuck it, right? Like we'll just cut costs here, and we know that like players are going to hate the fact that this thing is not there or whatever, but we think that they'll put up with it, right?
Yeah, I think maybe that's what it is. Yeah, I think they'll put up with it anyways. It's kind of if that's the vibe because you could have and you had the resources to do so, then you're just like
it's if you think you can get away if you're getting away with it rather than you just can't, right? That's when I think to me that's where I think and I think the other side of all of this is as people as Americans, English-speaking Americans, are most of the stuff that we play is made basically for us, right? Every once in a while, like I'll dip into some like random title that is made by a non-English developer from some locale, and have some pretty weird experiences, like where there's a lot of jank involved in the process, right? And it's something to consider. I really think about is it's really easy as a person who like never runs into jank normally, right? Because to then when you do run into it, to be particularly aggressive and incensed about it, right? And this is that reminder that like these are really hard problems always, right? And the stuff that we have to deal with very occasionally is the stuff that people elsewhere mostly are dealing with constantly, right? And so it does mean also cut some people some slack. These are all really hard problems, right? And
unless they're a big AAA studio, don't
never
slack.
Yeah,
absolutely not.
Oh, they already have so much slack they don't even know what to do with it. That's called profit.
Gets no slack. You know,
no, zero,
none.
Yeah. But we're playing a small indie game. Cut infinite slack because this shit. Like we just ran through that list of stuff we had to deal with, right? And like, but it's because we have Netflix's support to localize into all these languages, which means we have to then solve all these problems, right? But that also means like we're in such a rare sort of space where like we have the privilege and the time and the resources to even be localizing the game in the first place, right? And also to not be under tight, like they've been a good partner to work with. So they're not trying to force us to launch at a certain time so that, because if we were under really tight constraints, like we might have to be like, not that we can get away with it, but just we can't. We would just be like, well, that's going to have to go down the priority queue because that doesn't stop the launch, but this other stuff does, right?
Yeah. And at that point, it's not about cost, it's just about time. Like you can only do so many things in a certain amount of time, and some of them have to fall off, right?
Yeah, exactly.
There's just no way.
So we're in this space where we can and therefore should, right, do all of this stuff because we can really think about like what is actually the best experience going to be for our players in all the locales that we're trying to target, and we can do it, but we're in a pretty rare space and most people don't have the chance at all to do this stuff, right?
We're in a rare space in the indie side.
In the indie space, again, in the indie space. AAA, no fucking excuses ever because they have infinite resources and people. And every bad decision done there is a management problem, not a we didn't have enough time problem, right?
Yeah, that's also a good note because you'll have hundreds of people working on the game for AAA, and then you'll have 100 managers in layers on the way up, telling everybody what to do to make the game. So, it's in some cases, it may just be like a couple of people at the top said, this isn't a priority, cut it. Right. Mm-hmm. And even though lots of people below them care about it, or you might even have like I can guarantee you there are people in Bethesda working on the game who have motion sickness problems and wanted a field of view slider, but didn't get it. Right.
They were probably every time they interact with the game during development, they were probably sick, but they were like, just part of the grind, I guess. And
it would take Steve an afternoon to put that slider in. So
that's too much.
Yeah. So, anyways, to wrap up all this stuff, demos on the way. We'll have some more information about it, and we're on a journey learning about all kinds of stuff. But once people get their hands on the demo, if you run into stuff like that, where it feels like, in your locale or because of some accessibility thing you have going on, that you weren't able to have the experience that you wanted, like we want to know, because in some cases, just like the keyboard layout stuff, we just didn't know. Like we didn't know about this kind of situation, or we missed something, and we would like to do right by our players if we can afford to, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's always worth learning about this kind of stuff.
Well, and so many of these things are a long-term investment. They're actually cheap, right, in the long term. So like the fact that we had to spend basically a few days, really probably 3 days in total, learning about this stuff with the keyboard support, right? Learning about it, figuring out how to do it, running into the problems, and then finally implementing it, right? It's now a solved problem. It's just solved, right? We just figured it out.
And if we need to add more languages or add more keyboard layouts, that this is solved.
Yeah, it's just solved. And we can iterate on it. So if we find issues with it, we can iterate it. Those improvements now just can carry forward, right? And even if we have to redo some of this stuff for some reason on a future project, like we understand the shape of the problem now. So it's now an easier problem to manage, right? And then similarly with lots of kinds of like accessibility related issues and stuff, right? So much of that is like, if you're thinking about that during development, all of it's easier to deal with, right? So even stuff that like we might find out about too late for Crashlands 2. If we now know about that thing, right, then that's now a thing we get to think about the next time we work on a project where we're like, okay, we're considering all of these things that come into play with this to try to make the game more available to people. And the earlier we know about those things, the easier it is to deal with them and to thread it through. So that's part of all this too, is just always remembering how the long-term investment of this stuff actually is cost effective, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, you solve it once.
Just solve it once.
These kinds of things, they don't change that rapidly. Like there will be people with color blindness next year and the next year, and it'll be the same types of color blindness that exist right now, right? So
it's gonna. And there's a fuckload of keyboards out there, right? But people don't mass adopt new keyboard layouts. It's not a thing. That's just not a thing that happens, right? So even if we never touch the keyboard stuff again after we solved it once, right?
It should be good.
We'd be good to go. We'd be fine forever, basically. Yeah. It just doesn't change.
So it's worth doing. It's worth learning about. And I think that digging through these kinds of things and learning about it really, it gives you a better sense of perspective about sort of how you fit in to the world at large, and kind of just how small your bubble actually is, but also how impenetrable it is. Like, it's very hard to see out of it. Right?
So, it really is.
So it's been a pretty interesting week, and I'm sure we'll have more to say about the demo and all that kind of stuff in the coming weeks. So that's all the time we have for this episode. We'd like to thank our producers Fat Bard and Sampa DaCosta for putting the podcast together, and thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, you can just go to podcast.bsketch.net, where we have links to the Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the podcast archives. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Goodbye.
Bye.